It is 11:10.
And wanted to welcome everyone to our 6th History Camp Iowa. I, for one, am looking forward to many more. And my 7th presentation, actually. But our topic today is Fort Des Moines, and Fort Des Moines, and I'll explain that here in a moment. You might wonder how I happen to choose this topic, and it has to do with family legacies, actually two, one more direct and one less direct. But it was a result of some genealogical research that Paul and I conducted in the past as part of our family genealogy research. And we'll explain more about those family legacies after a while. Of the 55 plus military forts in Iowa, 3 had the same name: Fort Des Moines, number 1, number 2, and number 3. And those are the way that that's the designation that many historians use for the 3 locations, 3 different time periods. And just as a note, we're not talking about Camp Dodge, northwest of Des Moines, our National Guard installation. That will be a topic for the future. So Fort Des Moines is on the south edge of Des Moines, Fort Des Moines number 3, actually. And if we look at our timeline, Fort Des Moines number 1 was established in the 1830s along the west bank of the Mississippi River at Montrose, Iowa. And that was actually in the pre-territorial period, followed by Fort Des Moines number 2 at the confluence of the Des Moines and Raccoon Rivers. And that's at present-day Des Moines. We'll see maps of that a little bit more detailed. And that was in the territorial period from 1838 to 1846. The fort was only the latter part of that territorial period. And then a third location, Fort Des Moines number 3, 4 miles south of the Raccoon River at Des Moines. And that will be the main focus of the slides today, beginning 1901. When we look at a map, we can begin to understand why the 3 locations. The Black Hawk Purchase was made in 1832, and by 1834, Fort Des Moines number 1 was built along the west bank of the Mississippi River in southeast Iowa. So that was linked in with the Black Hawk Purchase a few years earlier. Fort Des Moines number 2, located in central Iowa, was established a few years after the Sauk and Fox Treaty and Session, sometimes it's called. And that lasted only a few years until statehood. And then we had that longer interval until 1901, where Fort Des Moines number 3 was established at the south edge of what we now think of as the city of Des Moines. The purpose for the first 2 in the orders, words included were to protect pioneers and tribe members, to provide an orderly transition, and as a base for exploration. And that period of the 1901 beginning for Fort Des Moines number 3 really began as a local fort, as we'll talk about here in a moment, and includes some highlights of the largest US cavalry post by 1904. By 1917, the first African-American officer training. But the following year, top Army Orthopedic Hospital, and then perhaps the most widely known first, the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps Training Center, the first of 4 in the United States. And then we'll end our discussion about 1950. But there are other uses you could see on the timeline that have occupied the the site, including a museum and memorial. We'll see a photo or two with that. So we're going to focus on the 1900 to 1950 period. Here we're looking at an enlarged map in what we know of as Des Moines, or what was called at that time Fort Des Moines. This was the 1851 to 57 period. The Raccoon Forks, the confluence of the Des Moines River and the Raccoon River. In fact, I read in one of the sources that Fort Des Moines number 2, which is located in this area labeled public ground, but had ceased operation by that time. One of the proposed names for that fort was Fort Raccoon. And I heard someone say once that perhaps it was good that it was called Fort Des Moines. Otherwise, the city of Des Moines might be called Raccoon, Iowa. But I don't know if that would have happened. That location at the confluence, some people might know as the home of the Iowa Cubs, either Sec Taylor Stadium or Principal Park. But at that time, 1851 to 1857, this town, this incorporated town you see a little bit of here, that was actually called Fort Des Moines. It inherited the name of Fort Des Moines number 2. But by 1857 and the prospect of the state capital moving to Des Moines, they did drop the word fort. You see about here's the Raccoon Forks again, and Fort Des Moines number 2 location. Here's a 1905 U.S. Geological Survey map, and about 4 miles to the south, the beginnings of Fort Des Moines number 3, some of the local landmarks, Army Post Road running east-west, and toward the west end, an area now where the Des Moines Airport is located. So that makes it, at that point, at the beginning, that makes it 4 miles out in the country, because you see very little land showing streets and houses between Fort Des Moines and the Raccoon River. And that brings us to some of the distinctions that I ran into as I was doing some reading, and I'll have a list of the references, the major references that we used in our research. But we did find out that it was the largest U.S. cavalry post at one point, the top Army Orthopedic Hospital, the first African American Officer Corps, and the first Women's Army Auxiliary Training Site, although there were others, but this was the first one. This was where procedures were developed and some initial instructors were trained. In 1900, patriotic fervor in the country, due in large part to the Spanish-American War and the Philippine-American War. Des Moines leaders wanted to have a military post again, and they felt it would boost the local economy and boost the status of the town. And congressional authorization was received. Basically, Congress said it's okay to raise local funds, but don't expect any federal funding. And the local leaders did become quite successful raising local funds to purchase several farms, a total of about 640 acres, about a square mile, the north half of which was crops and pasture, and the south half was woodland. The major limitation on that site initially was water. So for a few years at the beginning, they had to haul water and make good use of the water wagon. Some of the descriptions that I thought were interesting that happened, some of them from the very beginning, some of them came along later on, but authors described Fort Des Moines number 3 site as pastoral and agrarian, very picturesque with spreading elms, buildings using distinctive red field brick sourced from west of Des Moines area. They had a beauty and a sense of old world grace, the grounds and the buildings. And some people even said that this was the West Point of the Midwest. And I'd forgotten which source I read that in, but it made me wonder what experiences, what criteria people used to designate it as the West Point of the Midwest. As you'll see, there's a lot of training going on there. The main gate was at the south end of Union Street. And in fact, in both of these postcard views, the viewer position is the middle of Army Post Road, and we're looking at the main gate. And beyond the main gate, no longer called Union Street, it's called Chaffee Road. And that becomes a landmark to divide the east part of the post from the west part. 1901, the state militia used the land as a drill field, and it became a public grounds, much in the sense of Fort Des Moines #2 site at the Raccoon Forks. And here the land was used for recreation, picnics, for example, parade grounds, and July 4th fireworks. The dedication was a year later. The dedication ceremony was attended by 22,000 local residents, and they had food. That must have been a large challenge to feed that many people. Federal funding began to flow, and apparently in the Army, there was a need for additional infantry training. So it was designated as a cavalry post. And by that time, the state militia had purchased their own land. We call it Camp Dodge, the beginning of Camp Dodge anyway, northwest of Des Moines, about 78.5 acres. One of the first training programs was an infantry training program in the 25th Infantry to create 2 companies of military police to act as prisoner guards on other Army forts spread throughout North America. And this was not the first NCO or non-commissioned officer company of African Americans. That actually happened closer to the end of the Civil War. Buffalo Soldiers, many people would call them. And the focus of attention really on this 1904 plan with Army Post Road along the north edge, the main gate where Union Street becomes Chaffee Road. The focus is really the parade grounds. A lot happened on the parade grounds, and it was more than for parades. It was for training of various kinds, as you'll see in the photos. Married officers' quarters rimmed the north edge, senior officers the west, bandstand at the west end of the parade grounds, officer candidate housing along the south edge with stables built, and you'll see more cavalry photos here in a moment to see how important they were. Railroad spur came in from the northwest, and so there were a number of warehouses built, and that was part of the supply train there. Water tower eventually established along Chaffee Road. Blacksmith shop, very important for cavalry. Hospital, which we'll talk about more here in a few minutes. The new PX location, headquarters building, chapel, and a bachelor's quarters, which is called Clayton Hall. And highlighted in red, you see some buildings that remain. The bachelor's officer quarters, Clayton Hall, where the museum is located, chapel, memorial in between. Many of these buildings exist, and we'll talk about those in a number of different ways. One senior officer house and one of the duplexes for married officers. So those are some remnants that exist today, plus there are other buildings. In the U.S. Cavalry, a major effort in recruiting additional soldiers for the cavalry, included a number of posters. There's one of them. And by 1904, very quickly, their recruiting was successful, and they became the largest cavalry post in the U.S. So you see again the parade grounds, both for close order drills and for various training purposes. Here we see some training accessories. Some people call them hobby horses. And even the southern part of the post that had steeper ground was used to help train members of the cavalry. And you see out on the parade ground, again, more training going on. And by 1909, the post decided to organize the Great Cavalry Tournament and invite President Taft to that. And it included not only cavalry units that were stationed at Fort Des Moines No. 3, but several other posts in the Midwest, and one that I know that was represented was Fort Riley, Kansas, for example. 1910, a lot of construction going on. Here's the original post exchange building along Chaffee Road. So this view is looking north toward Chapel. And very soon, though, Mexican border assignment moved cavalry regiments to Border Patrol, this one along the Arizona-Mexico border. And Des Moines Register said in 1911, Fort Des Moines is nearly empty. So apparently many pressed into service at that time. 1917 saw a little bit decreased use of cavalry in the transition to mechanized cavalry. So we see a greater need for mechanics and mechanic training, and that did follow in several different ways, as we'll see. 1917 also a first. The officer class of African Americans, 1,000 were admitted, 639 completed the officer candidate school. And one requirement is that all enrollees must have a college degree, and that included James B. Morris, a name that might ring a bell with some of you. In fact, he served in the infantry in France under the Army Intelligence Service, but he came to Fort Des Moines No. 3 with a law degree from Howard University, and he was a co-founder of the National Bar Association and very active with the local NAACP, editor and publisher of The Bystander, which is a statewide newspaper for many years, and served several terms as Polk County Treasurer. A few blocks west of Fort Des Moines No. 3 is James B. Morris Elementary School. So he's been honored in a number of different ways. And he's just one example of the members of the first graduating class who have gone on to contribute in many ways. Here's a group that went on to contribute as medical officers. In fact, in talking with our son, Mark, who works at the University of Iowa, he looked in some of their records and said some of these medical officers attended the University of Iowa Medical School after becoming medical officers. Here you see one of the early surgery rooms with what we now think of as rather primitive surgical apparatus, and even the light fixture is something that that has been updated in many ways, but this is was typical of the orthopedic hospital facilities at the time, as was this ward. This is the south wing of the original hospital building. And you see that original hospital building here on the left. We're looking southwest. And you see the blacksmith shop in the distance, PX, and then to the upper right, the parade grounds. And mainly stables, you can see, and housing, the officer candidate housing there. So the hospital is part of this east ring road that becomes an identifying feature on some of the other maps we'll see. Here we see, an addition to the original hospital, the right part of this postcard, and that is one of the wards that was used with the orthopedic research and surgery. After World War I, about 3,500 soldiers were treated at Fort Des Moines at the orthopedic hospital there, along with an additional 543 amputees. So apparently from the readings that we were able to learn from, that there were a great number of orthopedic doctors that were attracted to this hospital. Patients came from far and wide, some of them not even veterans, that sought the expertise represented here in the orthopedic hospital. They did have a training program also for therapists and for nurses. Conducted therapy programs, crafts on the left, some outdoor activity, exercises on the right there, along with gardening and some additional indoor classes. You see up on the right, Corn is King, which looks quite familiar, and some of you familiar with Iowa State College agriculture programs probably wouldn't be too surprised to find out that that particular training program received help from Iowa State College graduates, perhaps some faculty of the time, and certainly Extension would have been involved as well. On the upper left here, we see clerical work and mechanics programs. Again, the transition from cavalry to mechanized units brought lots and lots of motor units to Des Moines. And here's something for Leo, who likes to see our national pastime. The Army Hospital did have their own baseball team, and it's a little bit difficult to tell. I can enlarge the insignia here, but there is a logo with a large uppercase F and a D and an M. Too bad we don't have color there, but they did have lots of opportunities for some of them to play our national pastime. 1920 began field artillery training, which you see here on the parade grounds in the lower part of this postcard. Barracks in the upper part of the postcard. And again, the south half of the original Army post land was more steeply rolling land, woodland, and that was used to help train artillery units. In fact, some of you might know of the county park that is located in the southwest part of the old post, and Fort Des Moines County Park is rather steep and rolling and has a landscape that looks something like we see here on the upper left. From 1922 to 42, there were additional training programs for cavalry, and you might recognize the young man pictured on the lower right. Private Ronald Reagan, while he was working in Des Moines for that famous radio station WHO, did start the home study program, became a private in 1937, did some training there, but 1938 he asked for a transfer to California to make possible his first movie screen test. And his first famous movie, although it's one I'm not familiar with, Love is on the Air. You might say, on the air. Could that have something to do with a radio announcer? And it does. So the plot may have been manufactured to fit Ronald Reagan. Actually, his first movie, he was in a crowd scene in the background. But in Love is on the Air, he was one of the leads. And he began during World War II, his assignment at Fort Mason, San Francisco. As a captain, he was involved in producing and appearing in over 400 training films, and was a member of the a member of the Army Reserve until 1953. The 1940 artillery training was phased out. The 500 remaining horses were moved, I think, to Fort Riley, Kansas. And the stables were remodeled into vehicle garages and maintenance training. But by 1941, a brand new program to not only to Fort Des Moines No. 3, but also the Army. The Women's Army Auxiliary Corps was begun through legislation introduced to the House of Representatives by Edith Norris Rogers from Massachusetts. She had been, during World War I, a volunteer nurse, several different programs, including the Red Cross. So she felt, along with Eleanor Roosevelt, First Lady, that the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps should be established. And she also had leadership on the GI Bill during World War II. But the WAC units were organized to train non-combatants for communications as clerks, drivers, pilots, maintenance, repairs, and lab technicians. And these were considered essential services. And the 10-to-1 ratio, note, refers to the fact that many authors say that for every combatant, that there were 10 non-combatants in support positions. So they were really considered relief and replacements, sometimes for those men who went on to become combatants. First director of the WAC program, Ovita Culp Hobby. She was the first Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare later, after World War II. But the legislation, the federal law, authorized a maximum of 150,000. 25,000 recruits was the target for the first year, and for the very first training program, which happened at Fort Des Moines No. 3, there were 1,000 openings and they received 35,000 applications. So no lack of interest for the WAC training programs. The first class, 440 officer candidates, included 40 African Americans. And that was a 6-week class. Basically, they were training instructors who would be teaching WAC training courses, not only at Fort Des Moines, but Fort Oglethorpe in Georgia and several other locations. One of the first assignments, the Aircraft Warning Service, basically it was a spotter service, and they tracked aircraft. The training was to help them identify U.S. aircraft as well as enemy aircraft, and to track the locations. And that was all the way across the United States. Involved many graduates of the WAC training and others. Fort Des Moines was very crowded with training, and we'll see facilities here in a moment, but assignments were slow even after graduation because of slow acceptance of women in the Army and the even slower acceptance of African American women in the Army. So the Rock Island Depot in downtown Des Moines was a very crowded place, and many of the trainees arrived by passenger car on the Rock Island. The receiving station was a very busy place, paperwork on the left, uniforms center and right. And speaking of uniforms, the early uniforms received a number of complaints. And of course, it took a while to get uniforms that fit and were functional, but complaints about the hats, the hobby hats, were kind of a pillbox hat named after the first director, Ovita Hobby. They said the shoes were uncomfortable and the coats were basically, those were men's coats, but it took a while for government issue to get their contracts in place and start producing WAC uniforms. Stables were remodeled into barracks. In fact, some of the WAC trainees called themselves hobby horses and said that even after remodeling, they could, through their noses, detect that these buildings were former stables. Most of the new construction used clay tile blocks, and instead of brick, it was much faster, even though they were masonry and built by experienced masons. They used block instead of brick to make the construction faster. 112 buildings built in 5 months and 62 more eventually following that. And you see on this aerial, toward the top is north. So that's looking toward Army Post Road, and downtown Des Moines would be in the distance. The old post here within the dashed red line, that was the initial construction that served well for 4 decades or so until the large WAC training program came along, and then the new buildings, the new building south here was called the Wynn area, or as most of the WAC trainees called them, this was Boomtown. And this is an area that has several schools. By the way, this gravel road right here at this lower right corner is the county line. So what we know as the Des Moines Zoo location is to the left, along with the golf course. So the Wynn area was equal in area to the original or the old post, but it was Boomtown for sure. In fact, here's an old postcard that shows women who are marching from the Wynn area, Boomtown, to the north, to the old post. And the postcard was saying that they were on the way to the mess hall, but don't think that that would, the mess hall would hold enough. Women's Army Auxiliary Corps dropped the auxiliary and became WACs. And let's move on toward the end and show you a few of the sources. But first, I need to show you some family legacy. And for Paula's family, and she is present in this slide, they lived at Fort Des Moines. Her dad served in occupied Japan at the end of World War II, and they were eligible for housing there. So that's one of our family legacies. Another one, my aunt Doris was a WAC and originally heading here to Fort Des Moines #3, but ended up going to Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia. And then several references, a book called My Mother's Fort by Penelope Blake, and an issue of the Iowa History Journal, along with a book in the Arcadia series, also written by Penelope LeFew Blake, about her mother's fort. And thanks for your attention. So if we have questions, be glad to answer those.
Well, thank you, Paul. And yes, if you want to put questions into the Q&A or into the chat, we've been doing both in the end. Q&A is usually a little easier, but really grateful for a great presentation, Paul. And please ask any questions you might have. And if not, I'll ask one verbally, but I'm going to let there be silence for 30 seconds or so.
Sure.
It's probably more like 15, but here you go. From the research you've done, Paul, and I know you've actually one just came in. So I had a question, is the fort being used today?
Yes. As I mentioned, there is a museum in Clayton Hall. The chapel is still open and part of a memorial complex there near the main gate, the old main gate area. And there are several other uses. There's a recruiting center and some training going on there. And then some of the land was sold off following 1950, and that's when buildings were removed, for example. As far as I know, all of the boomtown, the Wynn area, was removed. But we have a Des Moines Police Department facility. I think that's a training facility there, and some other city uses as well. So about half the, well, perhaps a third of the parade grounds is now full of apartments. And some of the buildings, the officer candidate housing used by Department of Corrections. So the site is being used. It's much smaller and compact and has fewer facilities, but there are some remnants, as we talked about earlier.
And then just a comment that Ken Vandervoot entered Fort Des Moines as a civilian in 1967, left as a USAF Airman Basic that same day. So very good. Thanks for your service, Ken. Nathan Erickson asks, how long was the hospital operating after 1917? And did it then have any connections to the VA hospital further north in Des Moines? I can say, Paul, just before you jump in there, pretty sure VA hospital opened right around 1930 or so. I've done a little work on that. It's been a while since I did the digging, but
yeah. Well, I know that the U.S. Army Hospital 26, that often referred to as the orthopedic hospital, that did operate into the 20s, but I don't know how far into the 20s that operated. So it's still a possibility that that may have morphed into the VA facilities, because I think it really functioned as a VA hospital, even though it wasn't called that.
Very good. I'm going to give one more question. Sorry. I know you addressed this a little bit, Paul, and referenced medical officers too. But do you know the number of African-American classes that graduated? I suppose you'd say 3. There were, the officers, first lieutenants, second lieutenants, and captains. So those were the military. And then there were the 2 medical groups, the dentists and the doctors. So depending on how you want to count those,
yes, and I don't know how many classes there were of OCS candidates who completed. I really didn't find any information other than on the first class. And I think it was in part because they played such an important role, World War I in France. Plus, many of them, as I alluded to with the attorneys, the the contribution that they made, not only here in Iowa, but in other parts of the country. They were a rather stellar class.
And I hate to do this because we still have some great questions. I'm sure Paul would take those, but we are going to transition to the closing session. We've gone just a little bit past our 40 minutes. So I'm going to stop recording, end this session, and the